Hi everyone, Cam here from Yes Auto. Now if I say the words affordable SUV, you probably think of the Tesla Model Y, right? Well, it's currently not available in the UK and there are alternatives out there. And we've got two of them here today. Now the first one is this, the Ford Mustang Mach-E, and the other is this, the Volkswagen ID.4. And today, I'm going to compare the two to see which of these very different rivals is the best affordable electric SUV. But before I get into this comparison, remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more awesome videos just like this one. Now we'll start things off with the ID.4, and it's the more sensible looking car of the two. You might call it boring, but really it's probably going to sell a little bit better because it will just appeal to a broader array of people. So the ID.4 shares its underpinnings with the ID.3 hatchback, and I like that the two kind of look like they're related. They're both part of the Volkswagen electric family. However, I think the ID.4 actually looks a little bit better because you have a flatter front end and a higher bonnet line for that SUV-like look. And I just think it gives the car a bit more presence on the road. Now you've got LED lights here, but there isn't actually a light bar that runs across the front. It's just a white strip.
Yeah, I'm just going to stop you right there. There's actually been an update to the ID.4 lineup since we made this video, and you can now actually get a light-up front end. There's also 3 different trim levels to choose from: the Life, the Family, and the Max. And the First Edition, which we base this whole review off, has been discontinued.
It's a little bit more dull back here, but again, Volkswagen has never really created ultra exciting looking cars. It's smart, sophisticated, and sensible. Those aren't really words that you would use to describe the Ford Mustang Mach-E. I know what you're probably thinking. This isn't a Mustang. A Mustang is a muscle car. This is an electric SUV. And, well, you're right. The reason that Ford has done this is partly down to marketing, to get people excited about electric cars, but there's also a very good chance this will play a role similar to that of the Porsche Cayenne, which saved the 911, because they're producing a big electric car. It's an SUV, so it's going to sell in huge numbers. It means that their emissions will go down, so they can continue selling special cars like the Ford Mustang. So what makes it look like a Mustang then? Well, you've got this ridges in the bonnet that are very Mustang-esque. The front of it, I guess there's a very small nod to the Mustang with the shape of the grille here, and of course you've got the massive pony in the middle. These lights though don't look anything like a Mustang. Those are unique to the Mach-E. Now, moving further around, this is actually, while we've got the top spec ID.4 here, this one is kind of one of the mid-range, and we've actually got the smallest 18-inch wheels on here. And I do think they look like they're dwarfed a little bit compared to the rest of the car. Now, this has a much sportier silhouette compared to the ID.4. The roofline slopes down at a much steeper angle. Again, we've got a little bit of a wing here, but because it's a dual tone, which is kind of like what we have on the ID.4, but it's done a little bit differently on the Mustang. They're trying to trick you into thinking that it's got a lower roofline than it actually does, so that shouldn't compromise headroom. Now things get very Mustang at the back. Another big old pony in the middle of the boot, but we've got the iconic 3 tail lights back here. Again, it doesn't look exactly like a Mustang, but what I do like is that they've actually incorporated a little bit of a boot spoiler back here to give it a sportier edge. So while the ID.4 is the sensible version, this is the car that you buy if you like your SUVs to be a little bit sporty. Now at the moment, the ID.4 is only available with 1 battery option and 1 motor option. Now the motor is situated over the rear axle and produces 201 brake horsepower, and that's connected up to a 77 kilowatt hour battery, which offers a range of up to 323 miles. However, in the near future you'll also be able to get less powerful motors and smaller batteries to bring down the cost. Now the Mustang is a little bit more complicated. You have two battery options. One is the standard range, which is 68 kilowatt hours, and then you have an extended range, which is 88 kilowatt hours. And the ranges they offer vary between 248 miles and 379 miles of range. Now that 379 is not any more than what you get on the ID.4, but it's more than pretty much anything you can get on the market at the moment in the UK. Now you've also got different powertrain options available too. There's a rear-wheel drive version and an all-wheel drive. Now the all-wheel drive version is faster in a straight line, but you get less range than what you get on the rear-wheel drive model. Now you may have noticed there's no electrical gubbins here like there is on the ID.4, and that's because on the Mach-E you get a front trunk, or a frunk. Now it's 81 litres here, which is seriously impressive, and you can store loads of bits in there, but I think it's a great place to go and put the charging cables. What's quite funny as well is that there's a button down here to open the frunk from the inside, and that's there by law in the US, so if someone were to get stuck inside, they could get out. I'd be pretty impressed if you could fit in the frunk of this thing though. It's a good job the Mach-E does have a frunk, because the actual boot isn't all that big. It's 402 litres, which isn't tiny, but it's not massive either. You can still get 2 or 3 nice big suitcases in the back, and there is a teeny tiny little bit of underfloor storage. It does, however, lose out to the ID.4. Not in the way you open the boot though. This is a top spec model, yet I have to manually open the boot. Anyway, we've got 543 litres back here, which is ginormous, much bigger than the Mach-E. And the only car really with a bigger boot that's going to be in this price range is the upcoming Skoda Enyaq, which, would you believe it, is based on the ID.4. Now the Mustang Mach-E doesn't feel all that Mustang-y on the inside. Well, I guess the top of the dashboard feels a little bit like the muscle car. It's kind of got that fabric look to it, which is a very electric car and very vegan friendly, which is quite funny because we have these very lovely leather seats in here. Now the center console is nothing like the Mustang, in all fairness. It feels very much like an SUV. It makes the cabin feel very airy, and we've got lots of storage options, a wireless charger down here, 2 cup holders, a big old storage bin, and a nice comfy armrest as well. But the thing that absolutely dominates the car is this giant touchscreen, which looks like it's come straight from a Tesla Model S or a Model X. Now it's running a slightly adjusted version of Ford's Sync 3 infotainment software, and for the most part it's really good. It's very clear, nice and responsive, and it's really easy to access the stuff that you want, a bit like Apple CarPlay or the navigation. The only thing I will say though is that it's a tad bit on the laggy side and doesn't feel nearly as smooth as what you get on something like a Tesla Model X, or what I'm sure will be on the Model Y, or a Polestar 2. What is interesting though is that you actually have a physical dial down here actually plonked on the screen, and it feels very cheap. But if you want to turn the volume up physically without using the button on the steering wheel, then you can use that little dial. Now, I do a more in-depth breakdown of the cabin of this Mach-E, as well as the powertrain options and the full pricing, in another video, and you can watch that by clicking the link in the top right hand corner. The ID.4 couldn't feel further from the Mach-E because everything just feels a lot more minimalist and simple. So we don't have that giant portrait display in the dashboard. We've got this very small and quite dinky looking infotainment screen. Although I think it does the job just fine. It means that the cabin feels a lot more airy than it does in, admittedly, a very spacious Mach-E. The only thing that really winds me up though is that you've got these touch controls for the heating controls and the volume and the likes of that, and it's just a bit of a faff. I've picked it apart on pretty much every new Volkswagen product. It works really well on the Mach-E where it is controlled on the screen, but I think it's a bit rubbish in the ID.4, and it doesn't even illuminate at night. So if you're driving along and want to turn up the heating, you've kind of got to mess around with the dash, and it doesn't look all that good. What is cool about the ID.4 though is that we've got haptic feedback on the steering wheel. I really like that. So essentially you don't have physical buttons, you just have little rumbles essentially when you press the touch surface on the steering wheel. So if I wanted to increase the volume, I can click up and click down and it'll give me a little rumble to confirm that I've pressed something. We've also got a small little digital virtual cockpit in front of me that just gives me all the critical information I need and isn't too complicated, and it's really nice. And whereas on the Mach-E, of where you have a little dial in the center console to change the drive modes, you have a little knob kind of plonked on the side of the virtual cockpit on the ID.4. Takes a bit of getting used to, but it does the job just fine. Unlike the Mach-E, we've got plenty of storage options down here. What I will say though is that the build quality feels like it's a bit of a mixed bag on both cars. On the Mach-E, some things feel really nice. The dashboard and the steering wheel feel of a pretty good quality, as do the seats, but there's quite a lot of cheap plastic around. And the same can be said with the ID.4. A really lovely steering wheel with a really nice grip. I love the seats as well. I'm not all that keen on the colour combination that we've got in here, but there's some really quite cheap plastic here and there. In fact, it feels a bit cheaper than the Volkswagen Golf GTD that we've got here at the moment, and this is a significantly more expensive car. Anyway, I've got a full breakdown of this car as well as what it's like to drive on the road in our full review, and you can watch that by clicking the link in the top right hand corner. But let's go and take these two cars out and see how they drive. So we're going to kick things off with the Mach-E. Now this is the sportier of the two, and in some ways it feels like it. This is absolutely more fun to drive than the ID.4. There's a nice weight to the steering wheel, and it also feels like the chassis is a little bit more direct as well. The only thing I will say though is it's quite wallowy. There feels like there's quite a lot of body lean. And that might be for a couple of reasons. The first thing is electric cars are very heavy, and the second reason is SUVs are very heavy. Put the two together and you have a very, very heavy car indeed. We also have the 18-inch wheels on this version, and that just means we've got a bigger sidewall, so there's a little bit more lean in the corners than what you'd probably get on a 19-inch car. But if you're looking for a driver's EV, this Mustang Mach-E definitely feels a lot more engaging than a lot of cars out there. Now, I've not driven a Tesla Model Y yet, because they're not available in the UK, but I drove a Model 3 recently, and that was magnificent. So when the Model Y comes out, which is pretty much exactly the same as a Model 3, only in crossover form, I think that's probably going to be the best driver's electric car to go for. But until then, this Mustang will take the crown. It really is very good indeed for an SUV. I also think the tech is really neatly integrated in here as well. There's no denying that Ford has tried to rip off Tesla with this massive touchscreen in the center of the dashboard. There's something very accessible about the way the technology is. So when I'm driving along and let's say I activate active cruise control, I've got a really nice little graphic in the center of my dashboard here that kind of shows my surroundings and shows what the sensors are doing. And I think it's really cool. It also feels a little bit more punchy than the ID.4. We've got the untamed driving mode in here, which not only makes the car feel a little bit more brisk, but it also gives a slightly fake V80 sound, which I actually think sounds really good. I know a lot of people have been complaining about it, but it's really subtle. Now, if you want the full review of the Mustang Mach-E, click the link in the top right-hand corner, because not only do we go through the cabin and battery settings and all of that, but we also go through what it's like to drive in a little bit more detail. And with that in mind, let's jump over to the ID.4 and see how it compares. So we're now in the ID.4, and this feels like a very different car. I think the thing that overwhelms you when you get in is it just feels like a more refined and slightly more premium experience than what you get in the Mach-E. And that's saying quite a lot actually, because the Mach-E on paper is actually more expensive than this ID.4. Everything feels incredibly well built and solid, and just the refinement is so impressive. It feels like a very solid and upmarket product. The second thing is it seems to be a little bit more sure in the corners too. I found the Mach-E kind of leans over a little bit, but the ID.4 is a bit more planted. They're both heavy SUVs, but I think the ID.4 is perhaps a little bit more stiffly sprung. That, however, does have a bit of a negative impact, because at slower speed on a bumpy road like I'm on at the moment, it can get thrown around a little bit in the ID.4. It does bounce up and down. Only if you find a harsh bump, but still, if you were on a really rough road, it might feel a tad unpleasant. Not off-putting though, not off-putting. Another thing that really strikes me in here actually, and this kind of goes back to the refinement, is the displays are much sharper and a higher resolution. So while this infotainment system is infuriating, and I really am not a fan of it, the center screen that I've got here looks really good on the road. It's very, very clear, and you've got a really deep black behind it, so it feels like a really nice premium product. And while I like the setup on the Mach-E, it does feel a little bit on the cheap side. Now in sport mode, it doesn't feel quite as quick as the Mach-E, but in all fairness, they're not far off each other. It still feels like a pretty brisk car, but you don't have that fake V8 burble going on in the background to make you think that you're driving a muscle car. This is very much an electric car, an out-and-out electric car. I just feel like the Mach-E's got a little bit more character than the ID.4. I also think the ID.4 is a bit more dull compared to a Mach-E. So while it's, I would say, easier to drive, it's more intuitive, feels more refined, and is actually really great behind the wheel. The Mach-E is such a ridiculous car, trying to pretend that it's a Mustang, that there's a certain charm to it that the ID.4 doesn't have. So, to sum it all up, I think the best all-rounder is the ID.4. Sure, it feels a little bit cheap on the inside, but it feels like such a solid product. It's nice and easy to drive and feels like a really premium, well put together electric SUV. And it's got a great range. But if it were my money, the car I would go for is the Mach-E. And I know it's so controversial because it's not really a Mustang. But I love what Ford has done here. It looks different, it looks interesting, and from some angles it's hideous, from other angles it looks really cool. It's a proper sports SUV, and while it's not really great in the corners, there is an element of it being a big electric muscle car, and I really like that about it. Now that brings me on to price. This starts at just over £40,000. And so does the ID.4, but the ID.4 is only available in the first edition.
Not anymore, it isn't. The Life is the new entry-level car, and it starts at £41,570.
The top spec version of this comes in at 58 grand. So we've yet to see what the cheaper, slightly less powerful versions of the ID.4 will be like. Perhaps they might be a slightly better version to go for. But of course, you can always head over to yesauto.com to find out all the great new and used deals you could get on the Ford Mustang Mach-E and Volkswagen ID.4 when they become available.